There's no one.
Well, it's 7:31, so we'll get started.
Yeah.
Thanks everybody for your patience and giving me time to get the PowerPoint up and running. So here's our agenda for the evening. We'll do a few announcements. We'll do our feature speaker, have a break, and on to branch reports and announcements. And time permitting, we hope to do the brick wall bomb for somebody in the audience tonight. So welcome. Our meetings are open to the public. Is there anybody here who is new to us, who has never been to one of our meetings before? Okay, well, welcome back everybody. I want to give notice that the November meeting will be our annual general meeting and our annual elections. The positions of chair, vice chair, treasurer, and secretary are all up for grabs. I do have some volunteers who would like to leave and some who would like to stay. So, but if you're interested in one of those positions, please let me know. Also, non-elected positions, we're looking for volunteers to head Meeting Refreshment Committee and the Education Committee. Not to mention members of some of those committees and a few others. Tony could use more help. We're doing well, but we could always use more help. Places of worship, I'm not sure anything or much is getting done, barring what Janice Carter is doing with the east end of the region. Cemeteries are moving ahead. Publicity, Joyce is managing on her own, and I'm sure she'd love some help with that. And Colleen has certainly asked for more articles for the newsletter. So if you can help with any of that, please let me know. We showed this last month, but I want to say it again. We've got some new books from the provincial body, Ontario Land Records and Ontario Municipal Records, both written by Dr. Fraser Dunford. They're in the beginners series. So they are in the process of being cataloged for our branch library at the Whitby Public Library. And just another mention, Toronto branch is holding a day-long workshop on Atlantic Canada genealogy. There's still time to sign up. It's Saturday the 17th of October, and as far as I'm aware, it's still open. They haven't closed the registration. And again, in Uxbridge, the Uxbridge Genealogy Group is partnering and with, I believe it's the Senior Center, to have Laurie Ashofsky and her brand new British Home Child book. She will be doing readings, and there's tea as well, apparently. And that's my little bit at the very beginning. So at this point, Janice, Joyce, are you going to introduce our speaker?
I can introduce myself.
You're a very versatile guy. So Guy...
That's okay, sorry about that.
Our guy is going to introduce himself, Jim Bowen. Can everybody please welcome him?
So thanks a lot for the opportunity to come and present. We'll have to pull up my slides there.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So here's the title we've got here, and it is looking at She Was What? At 16? An early 19th century traveling preacher, dedication, heroics, scandal, and tragedy. So what I'm going to talk about over the next bit, and it may be a bit more than a bit, is about the Bible Christian Connection and their female itinerant preachers. Now, you may think, what are these individuals? Well, this newspaper clipping from 1824 gives you some concept of what these Bible Christian preachers were about. It says, in the neighborhood of Greenwich and Deptford, there has appeared within the last few weeks a set of female fanatics who assumed the name of Bryanites, and I'll explain to you where Bryanites come from in the future. Oh, thanks. Holding forth in the most public thoroughfare. Their novelty as female ranters, so another term, ranters and fanatics, generally attracts a multitude of onlookers, or lookers on, chiefly from motives of curiosity. Okay, this is from 1824. So you may ask, why on earth would a 40-something-year-old, almost 50-year-old male living in Ontario have any interest in these female ranters? Well, this story actually starts in Ajax, Ontario. And this is, for those of you that live in the Ajax area, this is Elizabeth Street Pioneer Cemetery. And it's sitting quietly, just sitting there now with lovely stones all put in concrete. If you look at the pictures from the newspapers, they used to be piled up in a big pile. But this is actually a Bible Christian cemetery that exists in Ajax. And it's this headstone here of Elizabeth Curtis, who lived between 1790 and 1863, that starts the story. This is a stone of Elizabeth, and she was the wife of Andrew Corey. So sitting in Ajax, this unassuming cemetery stone is sitting there. And this is actually my family ancestors. The Mary on the other side, the wife of John Curtis, is my fourth great-grandmother. And she was born in Devonshire in 1769. And by some chance, because the stones looked the same, the stones were laid together in the concrete together. So Elizabeth Curtis, she was actually one of these itinerant preachers. And she started being a preacher and being a ranter or a Bryanite in 1820 at the age of 30. So she was fairly mature as things go for the turn of the 19th century. Her brothers William was also a preacher, and Thomas Curtis, who came here in 1833 and settled in Curtis, Ontario, obviously, were also itinerant preachers. So if you look at any references towards Thomas Curtis locally here, he was actually a lay preacher throughout the Ajax, Whitby, and Durham region. Now Elizabeth served for 11 years as a preacher. So she went from her age of 30 to the age of 41 as an itinerant preacher. Very, very uncommon to have such a professional woman in the turn of the 19th century and serving within the church. Whether it be as an evangelical preacher or whatever, she still had a career functionally serving the people of southwest England. And at the age of 41, she married Andrew Corey, as you saw in the stone, on the 8th of April, 1832 in Cornwall. So that seems very atypical. What we're having is a group of women that, or as part of the story, a lady that lived to be 41 before she married, and then went on to have presumably a family. Unfortunately, Andrew Corey died the next year. Andrew Corey died coming to a General Assembly meeting of the Bible Christians. There's two different stories as to how Andrew Corey died, or different iterations of it. Some things you read, he died because the captain of the boat was drunk. And a more recent article I read with respect to the inquest of the problem was that they were actually having a very strange practice in the boat, basically just tipped because of the way it was moored to the dock. So she ended up being a widow at age 42. And she was basically had gone and married Andrew. And what we don't see from this story is that she was actually pregnant at the time when Andrew died. Her first child wasn't born until January of 1834, and Andrew never saw his child. So the child is actually Annie Corey Curtis. Annie Corey Curtis came to Canada in 1852 and lived in Port Perry and in Prince Albert area, and was part of the Curtis Jeffrey Saddlery family. So what we have here is and Elizabeth Corey living with John Curtis in Bucklandborough in the 1841 census. So they actually end up staying in England much longer than their siblings who came in 1833 and 1840s accordingly. So my question was this story just a one-off? Is this itinerant preacher just, I think, one example, or is it an anomaly as to what happened to these women? So what I'm going to talk to you about then over the next while is to give you a brief overview of who the Bible Christians were and what the church was, and just sort of a show of hands. Does anyone know if they have Bible Christian ancestry within their? We've got 3 or 4 people. Okay, so we'll do a review for you people and a little bit of an introduction for others. What we're going to look at specifically, we're going to do a brief overview of the Bible Christian Church, but pretty much focus on the female itinerants, what they did, where they went. And then I'm just going to give you a brief overview of sort of methods that can assist you as you're looking for Bible Christian relatives. It may be things that you've already come across, but these are basically some tips that I've used to find out this information for these preachers. And then we'll obviously have discussion and questions as we go. What I want you to gain out of the talk is basically to be able to describe what was the Bible Christian connection, where did it come from, who were these female itinerants. I'm also going to focus a little bit, and I'll explain to you in a second, a little bit on the demographics of these women, and then give some idea of where they went, what happened to them. Much of what has been written about them has been related to their time during their itinerancy. There have been a few select publications that have actually looked at and writings to show what happened to them after they left their traveling days in the southern part of England. So just down the road, I'm completely disoriented, I think that way, behind me, is this sign. If you're coming up Curtis Road, you will find the Bible Christian plaque for the church. It is located at Ebenezer United Church, which is a Bible Christian chapel. And this is basically gives you a high-end overview of what these individuals and this church was about. They relied heavily on itinerant preachers, and basically it was a very small, loyal group of individuals that came from Devon and Cornwall and settled in Durham County, Northumberland, and in Huron County, and we'll talk a little bit about moving the migration to Huron County in a bit. And in 1855, the church became part of its own Canadian conference and separated from the British governance, but still retained as a Bible Christian conference associated with the Bible Christian Church as a whole. And then we're not going to get into the sort of the history of Canadian Methodism, so to speak, except for one slide. And because of various different financial aspects, ability to maintain membership, the Methodist churches all merged in 1884. So if you are a member of the United Church of Canada, your origins come through to the Bible Christians potentially. So why is it so important to look at specifically this place? Why Durham? Why Ontario County? We'll put it into its old term. Part of the reason was the high density of population of Bible Christians. This is actually from the census report. It should probably say Canada West, but the actual report itself that's available online says Upper Canada. This is from the 1852 census, and actually for Darlington, I believe the 1852 census doesn't exist. So this is actually the religious, or the actual nominal census doesn't exist. I've tried to look for it. Haven't been able to successfully, I haven't found Darlington. You can find a lot of the surrounding counties, but getting at the Darlington census, you just have the agricultural available, as far as I can remember. But the majority of the Bible Christians actually were in Darlington Township. And you can see from the distribution of all the townships, so I haven't put the counties here, that you've got Darlington, Hope, and also Clark as being some of the predominant places, Dummer Township. But you also see in Usborne out in Huron County, where you see a large population. But the majority of the Bible Christians actually came and settled around this area. They occupied chapels, farms, and had a very high density relative to the overall population of the county. This actually, of having about almost 2,000 individuals in 1852, actually was pretty close to 21% of the population of Darlington Township. So it was a very predominant group of individuals, as some of you may be aware. So where did these people come from? Well, they actually came from Devon, and they came from Cornwall. Specifically, they came actually from North Devon. And the area around Holsworthy, and in the north by West Putford, Buckland Brewer, the upper county, Shabir, that's where they actually came from. And they got there in the sense that in the area in Devon, there was at the time, in 1815, you gotta remember that the Napoleonic Wars had just finished. Mining wasn't, in Cornwall at least, also wasn't as profitable. And this area was kind of destitute from the standpoint of a spirituality perspective, is the way the readings go. The Anglican Church really wasn't spending a tremendous amount of time looking at the spirituality of the individuals in this area of England. And so there was a bit of a gap. And also Methodism, Wesleyan Methodism, had also grown up in Cornwall and was moving and becoming more sort of institutionalized at the time, but also migrating a little bit then into the north part of Devon. The founder of the Bible Christian Church was William Bryant. He liked using the O'Brien as a part of his name. There's a bit of dispute as to whether he has actually any Irish heritage, but it is William O'Brien. And he lived from 1778 to 1868. His mother was of Quaker origin, so Society of Friends. And so he had a very conservative, reasonable upbringing. He also had some Anglican upbringing, as well as was influenced then by the Methodists. The one thing that was different about William O'Brien was the fact that he was very much an evangelistic local preacher. And he really, really believed in evangelism more so than the institution of the Wesleyan Church at the time. So there were a few instances where he was sort of temporarily expelled from the Wesleyan Society. And depending on which history you read, you will come up with the different events and what the tension was between the Wesleyan Methodists and his local preaching and evangelistic nature and his belief system. So at the age of 37, he broke off and formed the Bible Christian Connection, the Bible Christian sect. And in actual fact, we are in the bicentennial week. You should really be happy with that. We are in the bicentennial week of the formation of the Bible Christian Church. It was actually 200 years ago during this week, either between, some historians say it was October 1st that the church began. Some people say it's October 9th. I have a tendency to believe Thomas Shaw, who says on the 1st of October. So we're in the bicentennial week of the formation of this Bible Christian Church, which has influenced a lot of people's lives or ancestry here in Ontario. Part of the reason why we're doing the talk this week, by the way. Anyways, so what did O'Brien do? What he did was he actually started recruiting. Remember, he's 37 years old, a little bit more senior. He has a family. One of the reasons why he wasn't necessarily as accepted into the Wesleyan Methodist circuit was the fact that he did have a family to support, and they felt that it was important for him to stay with his family, not be traveling as an itinerant. And basically, this is from Shaw's text, saying that the whole future of his work depended upon the appointment of the right kind of itinerants, and O'Brien was fortunate in the people. They were all young, and I'll show you how young they were. He was able to enroll. A good portion of them were sons and daughters of yeoman farmers who had espoused the cause, the Thorns, the Reeds, the Cottles, and the Curtises. So you'll see these names coming up as we move through the story. Now, William O'Brien, he actually was somewhat kicked out of the Bible Christian Church. We're not going to go into the deep history of this either. In 1829, what it was is that he wanted to control the deeds to all the chapels. He wanted to really be very much a autocrat with respect to the overall control of the church. And there was a bit of a fractious dispute in 1829, for lack of a better way of describing it. And he basically separated out and went and created an Arminian Bible Christian Church, which then fell back, and those people came back into the Bible Christian fold. Slightly after that, he left for the United States and still returned, had a very amicable relationship with the individuals that are within the church, came back and forth between England and the United States, and he actually died in Brooklyn, New York. And this is a picture of his headstone in Greenwood Cemetery. When I was in New York, I was in Brooklyn 2 years ago, I went hunting for his stone. It is actually very nondescript, just sitting there on a hill, without any sort of understanding of what the importance was of his life to history from the standpoint of Methodism in England and in Ontario. So he basically then was succeeded by James Thorne. James Thorne was his his first primary pupil, so to speak. He started his ministry at age 21, so we're getting into the young category. And he actually married a fellow preacher in 1823 named Catherine Reed, and we'll talk a little bit about Catherine in a bit. And he assumed the leadership of the Bible Christian Connection in 1829. There was one further leader. The church only had 3 leaders. It was F.W. Bourne was the 3rd leader that led the Bible Christian Church throughout its existence from 1815 through to 1907. So this gives you some idea of the timeline associated with the Bible Christian Church and major events. Obviously, its founding in 1815. In 1831, we have the first missionaries, and we're going to talk a little bit about that as well, coming to Upper Canada and also to Prince Edward Island. The formation of the Canadian Conference, which we saw before. The 1884, the joining of the Methodists. And lastly, the Union of the Methodist Churches in England in 1907. For the sake of space, I haven't included the sending of missionaries to Australia. So Australians also have a pocket of Bible Christians. So if you're ever looking for family members and you can't figure out where they went, if you have Bible Christian ancestry, you also may want to check Australian records. And so what I'm going to do is kind of give you an idea from this 1833, and why am I looking at 1833? We'll describe it a little bit, but that was the year that actually Elizabeth Dart, who was probably one of the most prominent female itinerant preachers, came to Upper Canada. And it was also the time at which we started seeing a decline in female preachers. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what happened to these women after they left their itinerancy. So this is really tiny, so I apologize, but it's also a very important slide. What it does is it gives you the idea of the Methodist unions in Canada for the formation of eventually to the Methodist Church. And over here is the Bible Christian Church. The other player is also the Primitive Methodist Church, which we'll talk a little bit about. And then a lot of this is then also the Wesleyan Church. So you have all these branches. If you're ever at the United Church Archives doing research, it is posted on the wall, and it's a very, very good reference to have to try and keep things in context when you're searching for your ancestors, because it may mean that if they died past 1884, their records will not be sitting in a Bible Christian periodical or newspaper, but be in a overall Methodist periodical. So why am I really interested, and what have I tried to do? Well, I've tried to, as a part of this discussion, bring together 3 aspects of my life. One is my children's ancestry, and I'll describe that to you in a sec. This is my children's tree. It looks really, really tiny. You can't actually see it. But here is, my kids are down here. And everywhere I've raised the little dot up in the upper corner, those are all Bible Christians. So you'll notice that, okay, this here is my wife. Well, not really, but the dot looks like her. These are her family. This is my family here. This is from Cornwall. This is the Bones or the Bowens. This is the Curtises here on that branch. And these are the Thorns and the Allens over there, and Bradfords as well. I've done some reading and writing about the Curtises. And I'm also taking, as part of this presentation, bringing in the rest of my existence as a researcher and trying to bring in some of the ideas that I use in my daily job as a researcher at McMaster University to be able to take a look at where these women came from. Now, you might say, well, what does West Putford have to do with this? Well, my wife and I were married actually 17 years ago as of next Oh, as of this Saturday, I better get it right. Anyways, basically, what we didn't know when we got married is that both of our families came from West Putford. My ancestors on the Curtis side and her ancestors on the Allen side both lived in West Putford. If you don't know how big West Putford is right now, in this year it's actually 184 people. So by chance, we didn't know that we had come from the same place 200 years ago. So Thomas Curtis was married in this church, and her great-great-great-grandfather Richard Allen was buried there 200 years later. Imagine that. And to top it all off, one of our close friends, his family was also married in this church, and if you look at the registry, his great-great-great-grandparents, who is in Georgetown, Ontario, of course, so not all that close to West Putford, by chance was also comes from this. So there's a very strong history, even though we may not know it, of Devon and Cornwall ancestry. As it turns out, also the person that lives next to me in my office at work, she's my ninth great cousin or so whatever. So you just never know who you're related to, and you don't need to do DNA. Well, you can do DNA, but you never know how you're going to get. So anyways, just to keep this right, and Janet Few, who presented at OGS, provided me with this picture, because I haven't been to West Putford. Someday. So one of the challenges I was faced with respect to understanding these women were the fact that I could not find anything with respect to reference to Elizabeth Curtis. When I started looking for obituaries, trying to find something in the Bible Christian magazine, nothing was there. And it turns out that actually was fairly common. It's a very common occurrence, or it appears as if it's fairly common, not to have the documentation of these women be all that prevalent as they passed away in their 60s. We're thinking about sort of the 1870s, 1880s. A lot of their accomplishments and what they had done were actually somewhat forgotten by the subsequent generations. Their efforts towards the Bible Christian Church and its formation in near the turn of the 19th century had basically faded away in the memory of the individuals that were still around, but not completely. So this is actually a series of articles, and it's really well described in Elizabeth Muir's book, Petty's Coats in the Pulpit. Elizabeth's book is no longer in print, but you can find it at libraries, and I found my copy in a used bookstore. And basically, what she has gone and done is tried to describe and outline the story of Elizabeth Dart and other preachers in her third chapter of this text. And it's really looking at this editorial that occurred, a series of, not editorial, a series of articles, and this didn't translate well from keynote to, this says Elizabeth Dart Bingen is what that actually says. Sorry about the graphic. But basically, in 1883, the editor of the Observer said, hey, we've forgotten somebody. We've forgotten about the contribution of Elizabeth Dart, and published multiple articles and series publishing components of her diary, what she accomplished and what she did here in Canada. So yes, the women were forgotten, but sometimes they were remembered. And we'll go through some of these individuals and tell you what I've been able to find over the past 2 years while I've been researching. So who were they? Well, these are the names. This is the listing from the 1822 minutes of the conference. And you'll see these are the women that, names that you'll see throughout the presentation. And they basically listed this in the minutes of the conference, saying who are our itinerant females. And this is, let's just see, Elizabeth Dart at the top, then Anne Mason. Anne Mason eventually went and left to join the Quakers. Patience Bickle, Susan Furs, that's right, Mary Ann Soper, we'll talk a little bit about her. And basically it goes on, see Elizabeth Curtis in the middle there, and so on. So these are the women that were as a part of the itinerancy in 1822. So what was the thought of, again, these women? And this is actually specifically from the Manchester Mercury, and it's saying that women parsons is this new sect of Methodists distinguished by the appellation of Bryanists, so named after O'Brien, have lately taken rise and are making considerable progress among the inhabitants of Cornwall. I don't know if this is tongue-in-cheek. Their high priest, it appears, was once a rigid disciple of Wesley's, but on account of some disagreement taking place, in other words, not being necessarily aligned with the Wesleyan Methodism, he dissented from them and instituted a sect of his own. In order to therefore that his own followers may differ from as much as possible the tenets of the Wesleyans, he has adopted a new mode of instruction, which is no other than allowing women to preach. Now, this isn't actually completely true, because actually the Wesleyans did have women preaching in the late 18th century. There were Wesleyan female preachers, but they had fallen out of favor as the Wesleyan church became more institutionalized. And I think in 1803, were not necessarily permitted to be preaching in the sense of itinerancy. So what did I do to try and find these women? Well, fortunately, people have done some work before me. And there are 4 core lists that are available if you're looking for these women. One is by Oliver Beckerledge, and he put together an entire list of the United Methodist ministers and their circuits. This was done in 1968. Jacqueline Field Bibb has in her text a list of itinerants, again, compiled from the minutes of the conference and also from Beckerledge's reference. Elizabeth Muir has gone through and obtained a list of not only those in England, but also women that preached in North America, both in Canada, the United States, and PEI. And lastly, Linda Wilson has compiled a list as a part of her dissertation in 1992 when she discussed why there was a decline in the preachers and why we had less female preaching and being less favored. So I started with this list, and what I've done, and sorry for the axis there, is I've actually plotted by gender to just look at what happened, by gender as to how many men and how many women were within the itinerancy. Fortunately, within Beckerledge, you can actually see they have both men and the women and other churches in the list. And this gives you some idea that you can see the growth of the female preachers, where you have almost in the 1820s and 1821, almost an equal number of men and women preaching as a part of the Bible-Christian connection. But you can see that the growth of the male preachers continued, whereas after about 1826, 1827, we see this decrease and decline to where we have less than 10 women in 1833 preaching. So there was a brief trend, or not a trend, there was a tendency to have women preachers at the beginning of the church, to go out and preach from an evangelistic perspective to the people of the south of England, but that trend resulted in eventually a lesser degree of use of female preachers. Linda Wilson, in her dissertation, has outlined what were some of the reasons why this had occurred. Some of it was changing in attitudes towards the female preaching, being not necessarily as accepted. The life of an itinerant preacher was not easy, and we'll have a few examples of that. It was basically you were on the road, you were trying to find places to sleep, sometimes through rain, through sleet, through really, really tough conditions. And so some of the women did find it very, very hard, and you'll find them sometimes taking a pause from itinerancy and staying in one place and not necessarily traveling as you look at the records. The other reason is marriage. Remember, these women, when they started, were fairly young. Also, the other thought is that because William O'Brien did leave the church, there may not have been as much support for women preaching, and that the departure of O'Brien could be one of the reasons why that occurred. Some other things are the attire of the preachers. They may not have been necessarily as receptive to the men controlling what they wear and being proper and not wearing bonnets and various things and wearing very plain clothing, much like the Quakerettes, a very colorful dresses and hats and such. Also trends in society, the industrialization of England, the change in the way things are working, moving from more of a rural to a urban setting. And lastly, the Bible Christian sect, which came out of sort of being in the homes and in the surrounding farms, was starting to become institutionalized. The building of chapels, the creation of a more structured church from that of a sect. So these are some of the reasons why I believe that there was a decrease in these women preaching over the course of the late beginning of the 1830s. So what have I tried to do to try and find out what has happened to these women? Well, I've pretty much searched as much sources as I possibly could. Basically looking at baptisms, birth records, marriage records, obviously use of Find My Past, and also Ancestry. Looking at census records, England, Canada, the United States. Most of the work has been also looking at the Bible Christian magazine and the Observer. And really, I think we had some books here. The work of Donald A. Mackenzie is essential to being able to do this work. The abstracts that he's created and abstracting out the obituaries and death notices from the Methodist periodicals are an essential resource. Also looking at diaries and biographies, what's been written. And I've brought some of the books that I've acquired over the past while that are biographies of the various women. Obviously, histories of the Bible-Christian connection. An area that I think probably people don't spend as much time looking at, but it's been very helpful in this area, are actually dissertations. Getting and looking at dissertations where people have published specifically about the topic and being able to get at dissertations. You can order them from universities. I ordered one dissertation from Harvard. It showed up at my door. I ordered another book from Duke University. It showed up at my door. It's really quite interesting what you can do if you are able to pull things from different locations. And then you can cold email people. So I cold emailed Linda Wilson and said, could you send me your MA dissertation? Oh, she was very nice to send it along as well. And also then using peer-reviewed journals, what's in the published literature, things that are more tied to what I do on my regular day job. So what are the demographics? This comes into the numbers geeky side of things that I do. Well, there were 59 women that actually existed in the itinerancy, and I've confirmed their information about 42, about 71% of them. I'm sure who they married, what happened to them, where they went. The median age when they began preaching, so young, were 22 years of age. Elizabeth Curtis was actually the oldest at age 30. And Mary O'Brien, so therefore the 16-year-old in the title, was the 16-year-old that started preaching. In actual fact, Mary O'Brien had started preaching much younger when she was potentially around 12 or 11 years of age, according to her diary that her father had encouraged her, obviously being the daughter of the founder of the church. The median age, in other words, where half of the people had married and half were younger, half were older, about 27 years of age. So they served for about 6 years, from first marriage about 18 to 51. And lastly, most of the women actually lived pretty long, prosperous lives. They lived to be about 67 years of age, and some did die while they were in their itinerancy. 3 women passed away due to various causes, and one of the itinerants lived to be 92 years of age. Their years of service, they stayed within the church and worked as itinerant preachers for quite some time. Although many of them, about 51%, were only served for less than 5 years, there was a large group of women that actually served for 5 or more years, with some women serving for more than 20. What I'm interested in, particularly because Elizabeth Curtis fits into this category, is this 19% of women that served from 10 to 19 years. Part of the thing is that they were 22 or a little bit older when they started. They basically were professionals, and they actually delayed all of their childbearing, delayed everything much more like we have in today's society, where we're not necessarily having our children as young. These women are very good examples of female professionalism from the early 19th century, and that's one of the interests that is kind of different with what you might not expect from the early 1800s. Just going to go through some of the different circumstances or things that happened. Basically, Richard Pike, in his chapter in the Golden Chain called Heroines and Pioneers, outlined some of the aspects of their opening up new ground, where these women went, and also their endurance of hardship. And we're just going to look at a few examples here, and we'll transition over to Elizabeth Dart later on when we start talking about the missionaries in Upper Canada. So the women actually traveled and were itinerants throughout pretty much the full south of England. Although they were from Devon and Cornwall primarily. They did have missions out in Kent. There was a time when a group of them, and I think this is some 20-somethings, heading off to London. Is basically what they did. And they actually spent time preaching in London and providing spiritual support for individuals within the metropolitan area of London. Some of the women went down to the Isle of Wight, and then some to the Channel Islands as well. There was a bit of a migration of the church into Somerset, or reasonable migration into Somerset, and also into Wales as well, on the other side of the Bristol Channel. Sometimes the advertising for these women as a part of their promotion of the Bible Christian Church was not necessarily saying who was preaching. And this is an ad from 1826, a poster that says that James Thorne, the leader of the church, will be preaching at the Sheerness Circuit, and a female will be also speaking. So it wasn't necessarily as transparent as to whom, but a female would be preaching. But this is basically the existence of what they were doing, right? So just to kind of give you some context of this, who were these females? Well, this is actually from the diary of James Thorne, and this is in 1820, and he rode to London to meet sisters Catherine Reed and Anne Corey. So Catherine Reed and Anne Corey were actually in London, and at the time, they were just in their early to mid-20s. Sister Reed spoke on Sunday morning, and she preached such an admirable discourse as astonished me. Sister Corey spoke in the evening in the brook, and some said to 1,000 people. So they were drawing large crowds. Whether or not, like we said before, it was because of novelty or actual true spiritual seeking for to have an opportunity for redemption or what have you, they were drawing very large crowds as a part of their preaching. Not everything was necessarily all that rosy with some of the comments. This says that Brother Weil said he had attended the cathedral and other places, but hearing that a woman was going to preach in the roundhouse, he was determined to go. Going upstairs, he met someone who said the woman, in this case Anne Corey, was mad. He went on, and for he had never seen a mad woman, but when he got in, he had a very different thought of her. So the impression of society, and we may necessarily do that currently with respect to evangelism, was pretty much that these women were ranters, that they were mad. But from a spiritual perspective, when people actually really got to listen to what they had to say, they did actually provide some support and converted many, many individuals to the Bible Christian Church. So just to kind of touch base with respect to Anne Corey, she was like Elizabeth Curtis. She served for 11 years. She was stationed in Kent and in London at times, so she did travel across the south of England. She was actually the sister of Andrew Corey. Remember Elizabeth Curtis's husband. It was a somewhat very close-knit group, the Bible Christians. The leadership was a whole bunch of families, like we said before, like Thorns, the Reeds, the Masons, the Cottles. The names just keep on repeating. So it's actually a fairly small group of individuals. And she married, a Reed, but this is not William Reed the preacher. This is another Reed in 1829 in Cornwall, but returned to Kent where all of her children were born. And as far as I can tell, there is no obituary to her at all. Even though she served at the beginning of the 1800s, no obituary for her exists within the Bible Christian magazine. That's because we would expect to see it within 1875, 1876, maybe 1877 Bible Christian periodicals. Now, Catherine Reed, she lived from 1797 to 1874. Again, she was an itinerant preacher very early on from 1819 onward. And she, of course, married James Thorne. And this is the excerpt from James Thorne's diary. The 15th, this being the day appointed, I joined hands with Catherine Reed in Shoreditch Church. This is actually out in Kent. And in the presence of Sisters E. Runting and Ann Mason, there's a Mason, and Henry Freeman, and W. Strongman, and it goes on to say, and a whole bunch of other people that are not of importance. One thing that was interesting with Catherine Reed is she continued to preach for a few years after she was married. Generally, most of the itinerants actually stopped being itinerant preachers, but Catherine Reed continued to preach alongside James Thorne and also on her own independently of James Thorne. She did return to Shabir eventually and raise a family, but also was, Shabir was the main hub of the Bible Christian Church within Devon, and where the Thornes lived, and also to Prospect House, where they established a school for the children. So Prospect House is what she had responsibility for. You see in the census in 1850s, James Thorne listed as a Bible Christian minister, Catherine Thorne, and then a whole bunch of pupils listed at Prospect House as a part of the census. And she does have a death notice in the Bible Christian magazine. However, this is it. Mrs. Catherine Thorne, a relic of the Venerable James Thorne, fell asleep in Jesus May 14th, aged 76 years, and was buried at Shabir on Tuesday, May 19th. And then basically goes on to say, "Blessed are the dead which die in the Lord. They rest from their labors, and their works do follow them." And that's all we know about Catherine Reed in the Bible Christian magazine and the obituaries. So this is quite commonplace with respect to the documentation later on with respect to these women. And there's no other biography or memoir associated with her in the Bible Christian magazine that I've been able to find. So the other woman that was mentioned in the marriage with James Thorne and Catherine Reed is Ann Mason Freeman. And one thing that Ann Mason Freeman was actually the one of the Mason sisters. So Grace Mason was the wife of Christopher Curtis. Imagine the names all intermarrying again. She was also a preacher. Grace is buried obviously at Ebenezer United Church in the cemetery in Curtis. And there are letters from Ann Mason to Christopher and Grace, both before they were, after they were married. And so you get a feel from this diary about the relationship between Christopher and Grace Mason and the family, and visiting with Anne and their interactions. So it actually does give some context about their lives. One thing with respect to Ann Mason, she was a little bit more evangelistic than the rest of the evangelists, if that makes sense. Some of her letters and the things she said were just even that little bit farther out. She traveled to Kent, she went to London, she and Henry Freeman actually went to Ireland. They traveled, they were not necessarily satisfied with Bible Christian Church. And she married Henry Freeman, again from the diary of James Thorne, the H. Freeman, married basically just after Catherine Reed and James Thorne married. And they basically left the Bible Christians to join the Quakers. Anne's health wasn't the best, and she died at a fairly young age of 29. And then subsequently, and this text is actually quoted quite frequently because it does provide an example of a very early publication of 1831 of her memoirs and such being published. And it's this text that is used to provide some context from a historical interpretation with respect to what the Bible Christians were. Deborah Valens, actually in her text, talks a lot about from this text, and I think it actually provides a bit of a one direction, maybe a little bit biased. I think there are other readings. Anne was not necessarily representative of the other Bible Christian preachers, the female itinerant preachers within the church. Some of the other really exciting things, or the things that happened, was these women actually did travel into the Channel Islands. They traveled, they went abroad. One of the main examples of sort of distance traveling was Marianne Weary. And it says that people were really quite happy to get an understanding of what she was about. And she says here, it had been impressed upon her that it was her duty to go to preach to the islanders. She went, and the crowds of those who were called the St. Agnes heathens gathered to hear her. So she was actually a very good orator. And then on her way to Guernsey, and in March of 1823, she also had a pretty hard time of things getting there. She left Plymouth in fair weather, but for this new sphere, but not long before the island was reached, a terrible, horrific storm arose. So you see in the writings of all these challenges with trying to get to various different locations and the hardships that these women faced. Mary Ann Murray actually went on her own. She didn't go with a male preacher. She was actually out there responsible for some of these missions on her own. Similarly, Mary Toms, who lived between 1795 and 1850, she served as a itinerant preacher for 4 years. She was actually stationed at the Isle of Wight in 1823, and for 3 weeks there has been so much crying in the meetings, this is her writing, that we've not been able to close them until 10 or 11 o'clock at night. A parson threatens to turn me out of the island, for I am turning people crazy. So they were faced with some very interesting situations, and their evangelism was basically having a real broad effect on the people on the island. She married William Warder on the 5th of January 1824 and continued to live with him on the Isle. She was actually originally from Cornwall. So that gives you some context about the women and what they were faced with. So I just want to talk a little bit about the marriage topic. This is from the Bible Christian Conference. We've seen a lot of marriages between the various individuals and the examples I've shown you. And they actually had a recommendation in 1820 that recommended that our itinerant brethren who intend to marry, that they choose their partners from among our sisters, so marry fellow preachers, who have dedicated themselves to the service of God by coming forward as traveling preachers. And we do agree that those preachers who so marry shall be entitled to first support from the connection. In other words, sort of giving them a little bit more money if you marry a sister, so to speak. So what actually happened to that? Well, the marriages I've been trying to identify as a part of this study of the cohort. I've identified 51 different marriages that have occurred, so almost all of the 59. Now, there are some double counting in here. One of the preachers married 2 of the itinerant preachers because one died and she married another one. And likewise, which we'll see in a bit, Paul Robbins married one preacher and vicary, and then she passed away, and then he went back to England and married another preacher, and then she came back, Mary Ann Taylor. But what I'll just to point your attention is the blue bars here. These are the marriages between a preacher husband, and if we had an actual recommendation in 1820, very few people actually followed that, because these marriages are Eleanor Turner and William Turner. The other marriage there is James Thorne and Catherine Reed, and the third marriage is Anne Mason and Henry Friedman. Otherwise, we've had very few marriages following the 1820 recommendation to marry within. We do start seeing, though, more marriages out here in the 1830s, 1831, 1832, 1834, and afterwards. And part of that may be the fact that, remember, when people started, they were 22, and time was passing, and they were getting older, and they were finally thinking about settling down and leaving the itinerancy to marry. The number, though, of preacher to preacher, some of it may be because they actually have a relationship, but I also wonder whether or not it was somehow also by default as to who was ever left over. I know that seems kind of like a strange thing, but when you start reading it, especially with Elizabeth Curtis's, 41 and getting married to somebody you've known for 15, 20 years all of a sudden, I think there was a need to try and bring people together as they were no longer being itinerant. So I'm not quite sure about that, but this clustering, that's why I wanted to plot the data to say what was going on there. So there was actually, with marriage, things didn't always go smoothly, okay? And this is from the diary of Mary O'Brien. And this is the marriage in 1823 of Mary Ann Soper and William Lyle. So on Tuesday the 17th, surely Mary is worse than I thought her to be. Had she not encouraged George Lyle, that's actually William's brother, more than she told Patience of, that's Patience Bickle, surely she would not feel so much, feel so much from her marrying her brother. I fear this will indeed cause a chasm. On the 26th, it seems some have formed themselves into a committee and have tried the case of William Lyle. These are basically a committee within the Bible Christian Church, and Mary Ann Soper, and found them not guilty. And I've got these slides backwards. This is going backwards in time to the 14th. At Friend Hooper's, a letter came from Mary Ann Soper to say that she intends to be married to William Lyle. Just think backwards, like kind of blah, 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 blah. To William Lyle on Monday, and I fear it's too hasty step. We are invited, but I suppose shall not any of us go. And then this is now Mary O'Brien thinking now, I suppose poor Mary Ann Soper today will be married to William Lyle. What are my fears? I'm afraid that what I learned from Patience, again, a bit of a gossipy thing amongst, these are actually, Mary Ann O'Brien is actually still a teenager here. She was born in 1807, so she's still sort of in the teenage phase. It'll be trying for poor George Lyle. I've many times thought that William was insinuating, deceiving, flattering ways with him. I am now nearly convinced of it. For surely Mary Ann would not have given up so soon had not some guile been used. Okay, so lovely, eh? As it turns out, Mary Ann Soper and William Lyle actually left the Bible Christian Connection because of this upheaval and this scandalous thing that occurred. And the more interesting part is that they actually came to Canada. They actually, after leaving the Bible Christian Church, they came and joined the Primitive Methodists. And actually, William Lyle was called Father Lyle, and was one of the most prominent Primitive Methodist preachers in Southern Ontario. And same with Mary Ann Soper. She actually continued to preach in Canada into her later years, and were very prominent preachers within the Primitive Methodists. There's actually quite a bit written, but if you look in the Bible Christian periodicals, you won't find very much. You have to go to the Primitive Methodist periodicals to find it. So one of the main sources, and we'll just sort of get things moving a little bit more, basically Mary O'Brien Thorne, her diary has been published. It becomes one of the main references for us to get an understanding of what actually happened to these women. It provides a really nice context. It talks about her fears, her achievements, her relationship with her parents and such. And so really it does give us a really good understanding of what these women were faced with. Obviously, being the daughter of the founder, she did have different pressures, especially when there was the chasm in 1829. And we don't know here that the Thorne here is Samuel Thorne, the brother of James Thorne. So she had married into the Thorne family, and now her father was being ostracized from the church, and her thoughts about how she was to balance the relationship with her father and that of her husband and her brother-in-law. So it really gives us an idea of what the things were going on with respect to the church. So let's just flip a little bit, just to walk through some of the things that happened in British North America, the missionaries. So in 1831, there was a recommendation made to send missionaries. Some of the people from Devon and from Cornwall had already started coming to British North America, specifically to Upper Canada and to PEI. And there was a need to have spiritual support for those individuals that had already come to British North America. The missionaries that were sent were John Glass, he came to Upper Canada, and Francis Metherall came to Prince Edward Island. Elizabeth Dart and John Hicks Ainan, which I've never pronounced the name perfectly, they actually married in 1833, and then were sent to replace Glass, because Glass actually didn't handle the Canadian environment particularly well. What it doesn't say here is that John had already tried to make it to North America, his boat was wrecked just off the coast of Ireland, and he ended up having to come back, and that was in I believe 1832. And then on his trip back, he then married Elizabeth Dart. So this makes me think about sort of, well, all of a sudden you're marrying somebody to go to North America. Are these things arranged? Are they sort of marriages of support and having both spouses being preachers as a part of the missionary effort? Anne Vickery married Paul Robbins. They became another preaching couple and came in 1846 with their family. So Elizabeth Dart, this is her burial place in Bethesda Cemetery, just slightly northeast of here. It is considered by Bourne that she was the best missionary that her denomination sent to Canada. She was actually one of the very first people that were recruited by O'Brien, and although there wasn't as much known about Elizabeth Dart or her recognition of what she did, you can actually find quite a bit now because of the publication that was occurred in the Observer. They settled when they originally came here in Coburg, and at times she took over the ministry for John when he was too sick and bedridden. So she was actually a itinerant and was traveling throughout the wilderness and the roadways of Upper Canada throughout the 1830s and 1840s. This didn't show up. I used Keynote to make these slides. I figured I'd give it a try, and it didn't translate as well with the graphic. So I apologize for not being able to see it too well, but we'll kind of go through. It's basically, this is her obituary. Again, for somebody that was very prominent within the church and so important to its foundation, we have a little paragraph here about her death notice. And it says that basically that she was a Bible Christian missionary, that her health had been lacking for some time, and we have no particulars about her last moments. We hope that a memoir of such a devoted, I can't read that, will be furnished for our pages, I think. Basically, nothing was actually published in the Bible Christian magazine, so there really wasn't much more. Hopefully there was a hope that that would occur, but in actual fact, the Bible Christian Observer article in 1833 became the main information that we have about Elizabeth Dart. So if we just travel a little bit north of Bowmanville, we can also see the headstones of the other preachers. This is in Providence Cemetery in Darlington. This is where the Bible Christian Chapel was built in 1865. And these are the headstones of Anne Vickery, Paul Robbins, and Mary Ann Taylor. All are encased in concrete up there. One thing that is interesting on these headstones, and it's very hard to read, is that both Anne Vickery's and Mary Ann Taylor's headstones actually have descriptions of their itinerancy and their service to the church. I tried to rush them. I need to come back and give it a try, or actually see whether or not somebody's actually transcribed them already for me. Basically to describe what their achievements were, and so their headstones actually acknowledged what their efforts were, and those are sitting, I think it's at Bragg, is it Bragg Road? Yeah, that's where that's sitting. So we do have these itinerant preachers here, or at least their headstones sitting in the area. So Anne Vickery, she served for quite some time, from 1820 to 1831, very much similar to that of Elizabeth Curtis. She did go to London for 2 years. She was stationed there, so she had an opportunity to go to the metropolitan area. And she married Paul Robbins in 1831 and came here and was very supportive and also preached, as far as we can tell, in Upper Canada and Canada West. And she died in 1853. Mary Ann Taylor was one of the oldest. She lived to be the age of 90. And she was one of the longest serving preachers in England up until she married Paul Robbins after the death of Anne Vickery, when he came back to England and then married Mary Ann Taylor and then came back to Upper Canada and also preached. So we have these two women marrying and supporting and preaching along with Paul Robbins, who is also one of the leaders within the Bible Christian Church here in Upper Canada and Canada West. Another preacher that came to Canada is Elizabeth Trick. She died in 1872. This is in the Canton Cemetery in Hope Township is her headstone. She was one of the early preachers. She only preached for 2 years. She married Charles Henwood, and she was one of the first Bible Christians to come to Upper Canada. She came around 1829, and it does show in some of the records that she was still preaching in 1861. So although she wasn't as a part of itinerancy, these women fulfilled a role within their communities to be local preachers within the church and supported the spiritual life of the congregations in the area. And this is the headstone of Elizabeth Ann Sinclair. I've got a great story for this one, but because this is my discovery last week. She lived in Ontario as well. She died in 1871, and this headstone, I had a meeting in London and had said, okay, fine, I'm going to go try and find Elizabeth Ann Sinclair to try and find her headstone. So I, somewhat foolishly in the pouring rain, took off to Strathroy. Strathroy is actually really all that close to London. It's about a 40-minute drive, but what did I know? I didn't look at the map. It's all on the GPS. Drove off, and away I go on the 402. Got to Strathroy, and I thought, well, this can't be all that big a cemetery. Wrong. The cemetery in Strathroy is huge, and so I started wandering, looking at the headstone, saying, well, where could she be, right? It should be easy. It's on the internet. It's there. One thing you have to be aware of with cemetery records is that it may actually be from the records, not from the headstones, but actually from the database that resides in the office. So do not assume that you will find a headstone just because it's on the internet. So anyways, we went searching for Elizabeth Ann Sinclair. I roamed the cemetery in the rain, looking for no hope. So I said, hey, you know what? There's a car that is located at the office. I'll go in. Good enough, there's a groundskeeper there. He comes and says, well, you know what? The records for that part of the cemetery, that page, are burnt. They're no longer existing. But I'll take you out there anyways to see what we can find. So he showed me where he had done flags and where he was trying to mark it. He said, we don't know much about what's happening. We wandered around for 10, 15 minutes looking, no luck. We were about to part our ways. I was also getting late. Hopefully my wife hasn't dialed in knowing that I was actually late. Getting back to Georgetown. And as we were about to say goodbye, basically I looked down at my feet and there was a headstone for a Sarah Adams. My goodness, this is great, but it wasn't Elizabeth. The groundskeeper looked down at his feet, Elizabeth Ann, but it didn't say Adams. But when he then, in his haste, immediately tore all the grass that was covering all of this and said, look, here it is. Hopefully the stone will stay protected because it was sheltered underneath the grass. And there was Elizabeth Ann, wife of Henry Adams. Both Henry and Elizabeth were Bible Christian preachers as well. And so we found Elizabeth Ann Adams, or Elizabeth Ann Sinclair last week, kind of poetic, so to speak, of the discovery of a headstone. So basically, the Adams actually follow another interesting path. She was born in Kent, so this is actually a recruit from the efforts out in Kent. She served as an itinerant preacher for a 6-year period. She married fellow preacher Henry Adams in 1830, and she came with Francis Mentherall to PEI in 1832. Unfortunately, while they were at a meeting, their house burnt down. And so that was in 1835, and they decided to come to Upper Canada. And this couple actually shows an example of sort of the travels of what happened with the Bible Christians, where they originally came to Hope Township, then they went to Osborne in Huron County, so they went west, as many Bible Christian families did. There's a very important connection if you're researching Bible Christians to not only look here in Durham, but also always look out in Huron County as well. The two go hand in hand. You will find your family. My great-great-grandfather, for some reason, was born in Goderich. My family's totally from Toronto. It took me the longest time to figure out why he was born in Goderich. This migration to the Curtis family is the reason why. Because he married, his father married Mary Ellen Curtis, the daughter of Thomas Curtis. And basically, she also served as a local preacher and class leader. There was not necessarily Bible Christians in Strathroy, so they served in other Methodist churches. So I'm just going to briefly just close in the next 3 or 4 minutes just with some of the resources that you need if you're going to be doing this research. The first thing, first and foremost, is to use the Bible Christian magazine. Thank goodness for Google Books. Many of the years of the Bible Christian magazine are actually available through Google Books. It's actually the University of Oxford University, that has digitized their collection, and probably from about 1852 to mid 1880s are reasonably available. There are some years that are missing, so you can do work with the Bible Christian magazine. Don't trust the search engine if you want to search for a name. You're best to actually do some manual searching. Go to the table of content, go to the index, look for names in the back, and then go to the pages, because sometimes Google doesn't necessarily search perfectly as much as you hope it would. It contains memoirs and obituaries, which are sometimes 2-3 page articles about the person's life. It's very spiritual in nature, but they do have a lot of facts in it. And they also have smaller death notices. The Bible Christian magazine, unlike what we have, fortunately, here from the Observer, have not been indexed. They're death notices and obituaries. There's no index of it, so you have to go into the last page of the year and look for it. It has a strange publication. It says this volume of the series, and then another number from the commencement. So it's actually a 2-phase from the journal perspective. The Observer is the next main one that we have at our disposal. It is really only available at the United Church Archives. You have to go there and look on microfiche. It is a weekly periodical of the Bible Christian Conference. It's published from 1866 to 1884. The initial years were in Coburg, and then it moved to Bowmanville, so it's a periodical out of the presses in Bowmanville. It does contain death notices and more extensive memoirs, much like the Bible Christian magazine. And really, if you want to really get at this extensively, use Volume 6 and Volume 9 of Donald A. Mackenzie's work. Those are the ones where the Bible Christian magazine are indexed, and where you'll find the abstracts of the information provided. What Mr. Mackenzie has done has really given the highlights. There is sometimes additional content in the full article for it. The Christian Guardian then is the next periodical. It was really originally the Wesleyan Methodist, but then it transferred over at the Union to be all of the Methodist churches. Again, it's also abstracted in multiple volumes of his work. So if you have Wesleyan Methodists and or individuals that are after 1884, you're looking for a death notice, it's going to be in the Christian Guardian because the Observer stopped. Again, available at the United Church Archives. These have not been digitized as of yet. Spoken with people at the archives every once in a while saying, wouldn't it be great to digitize this? Wouldn't it be great? So we'll see. And so for those of you that haven't been to the United Church Archives recently, it is no longer out on the west end of Toronto. It is actually in Regent Park now. So it's on 40 Oak Street. Make sure that when you're going to look there, it's really the true fonts of the Bible Christian Church. It's it and John Ryland's library in University of Manchester in the UK are the two main fonts of where you will find information about the Bible Christian Church. I haven't been to John Ryland's yet. It's on the list because the real British records are there. One of the limitations to the work that I've done is the fact that I haven't been able to get at the conference minutes, and I haven't been able to get at all years of the Bible Christian magazine. So there is still some information to be found. Make sure that when you search things at the United Church Archives, that you use their portal, but you also use the University of Toronto search engine as well, because the archives used to be part of Emmanuel College at Victoria University. They are indexed within the University of Toronto portal as well. A few other things. This is the Jubilee Memorial from 1865, describing the history of the 50th anniversary of the Bible Christian Connection. I have a great story about this one too. I went looking for it about a year and a half ago, and walked into the Pratt Library at U of T, thinking as being an alumni of University of Toronto that I can go in any of these libraries, and as anybody can. And they went to go looking for the book. To the embarrassment or to the chagrin of the librarians, they couldn't find it. It was supposed to be down in the stacks. So that was in, I think, February, March of last year. And then I got a call saying, hey, we found it. So actually they did find it, and through a little bit of work, I said, you know, the importance of this journal, especially with the bicentennial coming up, or this book, sorry, bicentennial coming up, could you digitize it? So I wrote a letter, and they said, we'd love to because of its rarity. There's probably only about 6 or 7 copies of this book left that you can see on WorldCat from the standpoint of availability at different universities. Since I couldn't get it at U of T, I went looking, and I can get it at Duke University. Well, Duke University, great. Through advantage of working at a university, we ordered it, and both copies from Duke University, because they have 2 of the 6 or 7, came in a package with an elastic around it saying, this is interesting. Duke University in the United States is quite willing to send to McMaster University these 2 rare books and not ask any questions. Fantastic. So it was great. We basically returned them back, and then it was digitized by U of T. So the librarians did a great job of pushing it through and looking at its rarity as a document to get it digitized. So please feel free to go onto that webpage. They've done a really good job at U of T to get that images for us to look at. And of course, the shares books, they really are essential to getting an understanding of the migration, the chapels, the preachers. So always remember to go, if you're doing the work, to go back to her, go into her work and take a look. There's a whole series of different facts with different families. You never know what you're going to find. Every once in a while I open them up and say, hey, this is great. And so make sure you search her work as well as a part of the references. And then lastly, there's a new webpage that is in the UK called My Bible Christian Ancestors. It's a growing page. It doesn't have a huge amount of content, but there are things that have been added on, and every once in a while people add pictures or they add references and such. So I'd suggest that that's another really good resource to start looking at. And if you have something to contribute, I've contributed a few pictures and things to this. You basically just post it, and they go through and review it, and then they post your comments and such on the UK webpage. So just some acknowledgements. This is sort of my family for understanding my genealogical obsessiveness. And people that have also helped with this have been Janet Few. She sent me some things, pictures and such. Linda Wilson for sending me her MA dissertation based on a cold email. Could you send me your work? Great. And Elizabeth Bureau recently has been very helpful in helping with getting some context of her work that she did and the work that she has done with respect to specifically describing the 19th century preachers in North America. And then Elizabeth Matthew, who's at the United Church Archives, she's been very helpful in tracking down things out of the archive fonts to get at some of these documents. So hopefully that's been helpful. Oh, actually an hour and 20 minutes. Basically, sorry about that. What I hope you give some understanding of the female itinerant preachers of the Bible Christian Connection and what their fundamental role was with respect to the formation of this church that has a lot of influence in our area here, especially in Durham, in Huron, in Ontario as a whole. And to understand that although their contributions may not have been fully recognized as time passed, and we may have lost some of the efforts of their youth. Hopefully this presentation has given you some ability to understand what they did and at least to give some future research for yourself to get an understanding of the Bible Christian Church. And then just to give you a brief idea of what, if you're looking for Bible Christian ancestors, what things you might need to look at as you research the connection. And I think that's it. Okay. Hopefully that's of interest, and I'll be more than happy to answer any questions that you might have, or we can answer them. I've brought, just for sort of afterwards, I've brought forward most of my library that I've collected over the past 4 or 5 years, including some of those diaries. Has everybody ever used ABE books? Has everyone used them at all? Yeah? I don't know, is it Abby or AB? However it's pronounced. Abe? Okay. So Abe books? Abe books? I don't pronounce it right, so that's one of the things. It's a really grand resource. You can get stuff all around the world. I've got one of the texts from Australia. It shows up 5-10 days later in your mailbox. It's really well worth it. You can also, if there's things you're looking for, you can put your wish list, and it will then scan used books and stuff. And people are really nice. They send the loveliest notes about here. Thank you for buying this book, because no one's really looking for Bible Christian books except for a very small number of people, and so they're quite happy to get it off their shelves. So anyways, thank you very much.
We maybe could have a few questions. First, Joyce?
Yeah, well, I'll just give you this.
Okay,
Thank you, and then you
You're
can
welcome.
answer questions.
No problem. Thanks, Joyce.
Thank you, Joyce. Okay, any questions?
Yeah.
If my ancestors are from East Yorkshire,
Yep.
and I see them in the census as Bible Christians,
Yep.
does that mean that they converted or
Most likely.
they found that that wasn't
Yeah, for the most part, they would have converted, depending upon where they were living and the...
around here?
Yeah, so around here, the majority of the people that were non-conformist, so what I didn't use the word is non-conformist. If you were a non-conformist in the UK, you were not part of the Anglican Church, right? So the non-conformist or Baptist or whatever, but generally the non-conformist records, they would have potentially converted here because there wouldn't have been as likelihood of having a Wesleyan Methodist congregation, merely by the virtue of the geography. So what I would have a tendency to do is take a look and see if you see other Wesleyan Methodists or other churches of non-conformity in the area, and if there isn't, then most likely they would have end up going to a Bible Christian congregation, most potentially. I think it's really, you can take a look at the surnames. There was some travel, like in the research I've done, I really haven't found too many people from Yorkshire. The only thing you might want to look at is whether or not one or two, what year are you looking for, like
1850s,
1860s?
and they were Methodists.
They were Methodists, so most likely, if they were Methodists and the nearest Methodist church was Bible Christian, then that would be the case. Also, just be careful to make sure that the enumerator didn't just, for the census, didn't just go tick, 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 and not really pay too much of attention, because so many people, especially in Darlington, were Bible Christians that they assumed that all Methodists in Darlington were Bible Christians. Just to kind of take a look at the how it's written out, and whether or not it's just a, the family above is Bible Christian, and the next one goes tick, 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 BC, and also pay attention on the if you see BC, the Canadian government posting says for the census that it's called Bible Church. That's not correct. It's Bible Christian, just in case. Yeah, just check and see. Yeah.
Does anybody else have another question for Jim? Okay.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you for the
I
pleasure
will
of
take this opportunity to extend my thanks as well. And thanks for coming so far to
No
talk
problem.
to us.
Quite
Really
welcome.
appreciate it.
Thank you.
Okay. Perhaps Jim can put out his books and so that you can browse it at the break. I have one more thing just to talk about before the break, and that's I do have a clipboard here. I want your suggestions of what you'd like to see in the program in the coming year. So this is to help Joyce with finding lecturers. Anne also has one quick thing to say to us before we break, and we'll break till about 10 after. So Anne, could you just come up and show us your lovely artwork?
Many years ago, someone, and I'm thinking maybe it was Phyllis Reed or Marion Lapp, I can't remember. Anyway, made all these little cards, and people used to go around wearing them, and they have their surname list. And then gradually we just sort of stopped doing it, and then I found them in the bottom of my cupboard. So I'm going to put them on the back, and maybe you could look through them for nostalgia purposes. Maybe you'll find your own, or the card for someone that you knew that's no longer coming or something. But anyway.
There's one that says Bell on the top.
Yes. So anyway, I'm just going to put these on the back table. They're not doing any good in the back of my cupboard. And then there's some blank ones too. So if you want to take one to wear to the next conference, go ahead.
Or the next meeting here.
Or the next meeting here.
Yeah. It's certainly a great conversation starter. Okay, so we'll take a break now. Don't forget to buy your 50/50 ticket, and I'm going to rush back and unload the drinks.
So two will probably two. Basically, pack up my whole library.
Yeah. As long as you're not thinking ages and thinking, you know, you're forever.
How many people will watch that from afar?
Today, 8.
Not many. Not tonight, anyway. Is that coming?
That's great. This is the,
Good idea.
that's what happened with this side. He's Elizabeth's and I was at the Elvis Festival of all things in Hollywood. My in-laws live in Hollywood, and I was bored because you can only watch so many a lot. And basically, when this was sitting in the place, for $7, and just and then it was amazing. So I was like, Elvis, no one would want to buy this but me. I thought,
No, I thought it was
great.
I've been doing this
So,
for.
yeah, and then this one here, this is the Golden Chain. It is, it's actually from Australia, and S. Wade was actually Chief Justice of Australia. They shook the basically, it's this one here. I bribed my parents to get me for Christmas. And this is Mary Ryan's diary. So I actually
Well, they're all.
I think it's a big share.
Oh, yeah.
Because I more than Emmanuel College and the next year combined with the acting faculty.
Well, I when I was this girl.
Got the trailer.
Yeah, because
This one here is very veterans. Other publications that are not so much history, but then an understanding of
no, man, we're
foreign
just, it's just, actually, it's from the middle.
And then you get into the early Methodists. So what I've been doing,
Guess what? Ledner, our
this is my volume, so that's
Yeah.
what I've done is gone and very good. What I did is I basically indexed it. Basically, I was trying to then understand that way I have
Oh, okay.
what's happening. It's really important. This is basically going
Well, didn't have to.
I was actually a exposure right here. It's a Canadian article, it's and it talks about how Quakers influenced the origins of Brian is, I think his mother was a Quaker in there. So they
This one guy, he ran away.
So what you want to do then is it tells you that it's the Bible Christian Observer and the archives, and it's just basically a death notice. So it may just be very small. This may actually be almost the same amount of information.
England was brought over.
Yeah, let's check.
But you were like, oh,
Yeah. Oh, do you? Okay. Yes.
this is what's going on with this girl at Keenan. We're discovering.
They're very,
I knew all these
very,
relatives.
very tiny.
Or I grew up like one of them. Just lived down the street from her. As soon as I heard the name, I said, I said, oh yeah, that was the other side of this property. It was right dead on, right where the house was.
The church itself was really
Yeah, and then she just wrote me and said, oh yeah, they had this Haley family come visit us with her lady husband. Yeah, right back. Did he have a little Haley with her daughter Dolly? I grew up with them. But they didn't know a Bill, but they're good for No, I didn't know him, but I.
they were sort of second base of the
It's like this.
Yeah, I'm coming right back. Yeah. What time though? It was funny because they were just around the house.
There is some records for Thomas.
It was 6 o'clock. But when you know when I went, I just did some art. And his kids grew up on the street. My grandmother used to say, no one. East to west. We don't know if they knew. And then they come up and they what the 5 o'clock and he did. And my poor brother, he was supposed to watch. Oh, yeah. And
Because we were all eliminated, so you're staying on this boat. Living here, so we got up.
Clarington Public Library.
So you can take a look, but it's really hard to under newspapers. Newspapers, and you go to that, you put them down, and you put your ear in, and it's showing up, and you have like names. Maybe almost a search engine to get some of the text newspapers, not fantastic, but it's been a really challenging.
Yeah, I remember the old times, it was
Just being married. The real reason why.
Clarington Library. But they never as past chair.
Great neighborhood. I don't know if I've ever been there, so.
I know it's similar.
It is, yeah.
Yeah. Oh, that's
Last summer.
I do not.
It's a tropical.
I don't even know, I don't really even think that they are. They don't
It's really weird. I got off a plane in Dublin, and there's palm trees. I'm going, what is this? It's very strange.
I don't know why too, but
No.
it doesn't sound bad.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's also really weird too. I purposely photocopy the index. So as I come across America, keeping it track of the index. So eventually, I can't honestly this one here I just try and do. I've been trying to do 59 women and all the work here. That is just Mackenzie series. That's number 6. I didn't bring it up. 6 to 9. 6 Alan Thorne. Middle name is there's Barry. Barry's are also very justice.
He just brought it to me.
And then the other family that I don't have yet, so there's John. The other, John, Barry, they're all from Brad Street. My wife.
Yeah, I have the tape. It's in the Bible. There's the notes there.
And then so you can work with the codes and stuff. You're going to have around this. So Thomas came first, and he set up just enough, I guess, just go with 405. He was originally a preacher, and then he worked as a preacher until 1821. So he came from a family farm just outside of Washington. It's a great name, Memphis. And then Christopher Curtis was actually in Boston, and was in Boston. So when they came here, they really had terribly prepared. It's probably not the fact that they didn't have experience with their younger was they were transitioning to is their 20s, and they got back here. It's all pretty much farming. There's very few of these people were anything but farmers, blacksmith and stuff. But mainly, they're mainly farmers. There wasn't a lot of other occupations. Yeah, they did. That's what they did. So the weekly periodicals, they had to see how much they was on $1.50 per year. Yeah. So if you make the church, oh, well, thank you very much. That'd be great. Thank you very much.
Yes, they've been moved for most of the time. Right, we're getting.
Okay, if you can take your seats, we'll recommence with the end of the program here.
Just before you start, I'll show one more book.
I hope those at home haven't been too bored, and Dan's been holding up books for everybody to look at. So that's great. Thank you, Dan. So Bea tells me she doesn't have any correspondence for us. And Sheila, I just wanted to ask if you had a treasurer's report or if you're going to save that for the AGM.
I just have a very small report, so we can save it if you want.
Oh, come on up. I think it's been a few meetings since we've reported on our financial position, so probably a good idea.
Okay. I didn't report from the whole summer, but as of September the 30th, for September, we had $123.15 deposits. Expenses were $409.73. So the balance is $7,812.46.
Okay. Thank you.
Welcome.
So, Joyce, I've got a partial slide here of upcoming meetings. Have I got most of it covered? Bob Bell and Glenn McKnight are going, we have a title for next month's.
Read our new title.
Yes. War and Refugees in Canada Over the Ages, 1812 to 1918. I think it's very topical, so I look forward to that. December will be our bring and brag or show and tell, our usual format, and bring your treats as well so that we can all share and grow fat over the holiday season. And in January, tentatively, we're doing brick walls because that's not a good time to bring a speaker in. So we generally do a very successful meeting in January. So here's your early notice to get your brick wall together and bring it with you.
Or send it in ahead of time.
Oh, well, actually, Steve has a very good point. If you actually send it in ahead of time to our Durham@ogs.on.ca email address, then our premier research person can be working on it. Thank you, Steve. I've had something handed to me here from Andy, and he's picked up a notice from the Northview branch of the Oshawa Public Library, the one up on Beatrice Street. They are doing a 6-week genealogy course costing $15, so starting on Tuesday, October 20th. And they also have a 2.5-hour first Thursday of the month get-together on genealogy. So that's from 2:30 to 4 p.m. on the first Thursday of each month. And I'll leave the notice out here on the table for you to look at. One other thing I was just reminded about is last month when we were doing our brick wall buster, it was recommended that we should perhaps start a DNA interest group. So I want to know if there's interest in an interest group. And I have a sign-up page here. Likely we wouldn't start till January, but I'd like an indication ahead of time to see who's interested in joining us in a separate DNA group.
Is there a proposed time?
Not at this point.
Right.
But an English SIG group used to meet on like Wednesday afternoon, or Wednesday evening, and I believe that's free because the interest fell off on that one. So certainly it would be probably a weekday evening at the convenience of most of the members of the group. Just a quick thing from the cemeteries. We now have 5 township cemeteries up on the OGS e-store. The latest up is Thora Township. And, we have a couple of new presentations. Steve, don't laugh. Okay. Gaba Bendag Zijig. I've been practicing that cemetery, which is the Indian Scugog, Mississauga Indian Cemetery on Scugog Island, and a brand new section of Bonneville Cemetery, which is the Columbarians in Section W. And that is ready now and available if anyone's interested. And Dawn has asked me to make an announcement. And I think we should all, right now, give them best wishes. 50 years together, what an accomplishment. So they are inviting everyone here to come to their 50th wedding anniversary, October 17th, 1 to 4, at the Pringle Creek Public School. Best wishes only. So if you can make it, I know they'd love to see you there. Now, I wanted to ask if there are any other announcements that I may have missed. Anybody on the council think of anything? Okay. So at this point, I'll ask for a brick wall problem from the audience if someone has one to talk about. For us to brainstorm on. If not, we do have a backup plan, but don't be shy. If you've got a brick wall, and remember enough of the details for us to work at. Okay. I think in this case, Anne has volunteered to come up and show us something.
Can you get Google running for me?
I can certainly do that.
I'm not familiar with your computer.
Do you used to Google Chrome?
No. Oh, no, I'm sorry. I'm used to Firefox, but I don't think it matters.
Okay, then I'll just bring up my regular Safari.
I don't think it matters.
I don't think it does either.
Just need a Google search box.
Yep, it's coming.
That's much better than having me try to find it. Excellent.
Okay,
All right.
you might. I don't think it'll reach.
I better just leave it there. Okay.
Yeah.
I'll just bend over when I need to do this.
Why don't I come down and you can sit
Okay.
up there?
Okay. I know that a lot of people are interested in using city directories, and more city directories are being online. And I found a way of using city directories that maybe you hadn't thought of. Google has a lot of different ways to search, and one of the ways is to search images. So if I type city directories, this is just a general one, but you'd probably want to use something a little more specific than just city directories. And then if I put images, I will get a lot of images of different city directories. Now, if I put Toronto city directories, I get images of Toronto city directories or things like that. So now, I'm going to try, that doesn't work. How do you, on my computer I do Control plus and everything gets bigger. What do you do?
Do Command plus.
Oh, okay, thank you. Oh, that's better. Okay. So we can see it better. Okay, so you're going to get a lot of images of city directories. And then if you wanted to look at one of these pages, click on it. Now,
Press hard.
okay. Now you can go to visit page or you can just view image, and generally I found that view image is better because if you click on visit the page, sometimes it'll take you right to the page, but sometimes it's a page where someone else has a lot of description and that sort of thing. So, but if you do view image, you're going to see it right away. So now this one's not in English, so that's a bit of a problem. I just picked one at random. Okay, and with the plus and the minus, you can zoom in, and with your arrow keys, you can go up and down and look at the page on the city directory. So I think maybe I'll go back.
Can you go to another page on that same directory?
Not this way. No, if I went to the other choice, where I went visit page, then it would depend if it's on the particular city directory that I went to. If it was one that was in one of those programs that lets you flip the pages, then I could. If it was just one where it had somebody's grandfather on it and they put up one page, well then you couldn't. So I keep double tapping, and of course it doesn't.
No.
Okay.
Press hard.
All right. So now, minus. See the little X that's here closes that box and lets you pick another one. So is this a touch screen or not?
No, it's not.
No, I'll use the arrow keys. Okay, so I'll try to find one that's in English. I know what I'll do. I will put Toronto. I know there's Toronto ones. I don't know if any Oshawa ones are online, but
Click hard.
okay. So I'll just put Toronto city directories.
Need a 0. Need an O.
Oh, I suppose it'd be better with the O.
Space.
Thank you. Okay, so now I'm bound to get some that are in English, and I'll just pick one at random here. And view image. Now, and I can control a plus in and have a look at the page. So now while I have one of these up that's in English, just for any of you that may not have used city directories before, one of the great things about most of the city directories is that they're double indexed, first by surname and also by street. And so the surname one, of course, is very useful for looking up your relatives, but the one that's by street is very useful for looking to see who lived nearby. Quite often people would marry, or people that live nearby, or their sons or daughters would move into houses nearby. And so if you're wondering if people are related and then they live next door, that's a good clue that maybe they're related, although it's not definitive, especially if their name is Smith. Okay, and of course, as most of you already know, the city directories give you information that you can't get from some other documents. For instance, they often say whether the person owns their home or not, and they often will say the name of the spouse and where the person works, and all kinds of interesting little tidbits. So that's it. Anyway, thanks.
Anybody have questions for Ann on city directories?
No, I just wanted to say, in Hamilton, from when I was a kid,
there's little bells down the side to indicate that you've got a telephone.
Yes, yeah, that's right. The older ones don't have that.
And we had 4-digit telephone.
So now we're going to have the 50-50 draw.
We have two prizes. The 50/50 is $10.50, and then cranberries.
Okay.
So the last three numbers are 931.
931.
Got it.
Got it?
Okay. Dan DeLong and $10.50.
Do I have a choice?
Congratulations.
Yes.
Oh, would you prefer the cranberries?
Do you want? I'll let Ann pick.
I think you should take the $10.
$10, she said.
I've already got a really long
in case
cranberry
you win
string.
again.
Oh, yeah.
Christmas tree.
I could. I mean, we're having a family Thanksgiving, that'd be perfect.
Okay, and we have a second drawing for a bag of cranberries.
Last three numbers, 920.
920. Congratulations.
Whoever
bought for me, I got 921.
Okay, and I think everybody knows how to contact the branch, since there's no strangers here. Our next meeting is November the 3rd, with Bob Bell and Glenn McKnight talking about not World War I, but refugees through the ages. And the office will be open next Tuesday night and the following Saturday, with Steve in charge to answer all your research questions. So pop by and see Steve. And at this point, unless there are questions from the audience, I will declare the meeting closed, and take care and drive home safely. We'll see you next Monday.
Well, I'll stop it in just a moment. As soon as I put my winnings away.
I feel like making cranberries.
It was on the back of, I was doing all the etchings, it was on one of the etching things, so.
No, go right
So I
ahead.
went, sorry about that.
There's Steve.
Sorry, I went looking for ministers in here. Basically, this is where you start.
I'm thinking probably your email address too,
Ministers that were actually.
just so that I can get a hold of everybody.
So sort of the starting point of the meeting is.
Well, interesting.